Now, initially, my plan for telling this story was going to be to record the audio track and overlay it over some trail riding video. But I think this is the kind of story that really does best over a beer or a couple beers with friends. Now, I don't have human friends, but I have my horse buddies here, and I have my beer here, so we're going to tell you this story. Larry, who is quite the character in his own right, well, one day Larry came up to me and said that the next day we were going to go out and have breakfast together. So, to be down there at 8 o'clock in the morning. So sure enough, I go down there at 8 o'clock in the morning, meet him at the outside the mess hall in the office, that area. And Larry's got his big old truck with him, and he goes, go ahead and get in the truck. So I go to open the door to the truck, and they're sitting in the passenger seat, just kind of quivering, looking at me saying, who is this guy? It was about a 2.5-pound Yorkshire Terrier. Now, before I could say or do anything, Larry pipes in with, that's not my dog. That's my wife's dog. Well, I just thought that was hysterical. And so I chuckled. Hey, buddy. So I chuckled. And I get in the truck and we go riding down the road, and I've got this Yorkie in my lap. And as we're riding down the road, I share with Larry, I remind him that I used to be a pet photographer. And when I was doing pet photography, I had a lot of interesting people and a lot of interesting pets. And when I told him, I said, I saw a lot of foo-foo dogs, Yorkies and miniature poodles and schnauzers and shih tzus and lhasa and all that kind of stuff when I was doing the pet photography. And I said, no judgment or anything. I said, but I never met any man that had a Yorkshire Terrier that was not either gay or said that it was his wife's dog. Now, I really don't care what people do. I have no judgment on people's sexual preference whatsoever. It was merely an observation from my time as a pet photographer. And I did real well with the gay community doing the pet photography. But anyway, Larry smiled at that. We go into town. He said we had the dog with us because he had to drop him at the groomers to get trimmed. And when you're in Bandera, you never go to town for just one reason. There's always multiple things you do while you're in town because it's 10 miles to town. And my, that's a pretty horse, isn't it? Anyway, so we go into town, we go to the groomers, and he goes, I stay in the truck, and Larry goes in to drop the dog off, and he comes back out, and he's just a chuckling when he comes out. Just a if you know Larry's laugh. And when he comes out, he gets in the truck, and he's still laughing, and I'm like, what? And Larry goes, I walked in the door, Michael, and they said, is that your dog? I said, yes, ma'am, I'm gay. And so he just cracked up about that. So our next mission, I'm being followed. So our next mission was to go to the Dollar General and pick up some various and sundry things off of a list that we had a really hard time reading, which was half the fun of that, because I think we had to actually call Cheryl at one point to figure out what was, be nice, to figure out what was on the list, because the handwriting was tricky, and apparently we were not as familiar with those everyday needs as we should have been. So that was a hoot. Anyway, next stop was breakfast, and we went to OST, which was the whole point of the trip. Old Spanish Trail. If you've never been there and never heard of it, I encourage you to Google OST Bandera, Texas, or Old Spanish Trail Bandera, Texas. And it's a wonderful restaurant. It's got a lot of flavor, a lot of ambiance, a lot of John Wayne paraphernalia. The salad bar is a Conestoga wagon. The bar stools are actually saddles, and one of them is broken, and it says, stay off this one, it bucks. So it was a fun place, and they had pancakes that were like the size of a dinner plate. It was huge. Wonderful food. Anyway, great breakfast, stuffed ourselves. We leave, and the last errand of the morning, I wanted to go by the liquor store to get some more beer. because you can't run out of beer in Bandera. That's like a law. And so we go to the liquor store to get the beer, and I say the liquor store because it's Bandera. There's not like lots of options. So we go in there, and I find my Coors Light. And I'm bringing it up to the counter, and there's one other person in the store. Of course, it's only like 10 o'clock in the morning, so you don't expect a lot of people in the liquor store at that point in time. But it's this woman about easily my age, couldn't really tell, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but let's just say she had twice my mileage. So, and she was standing at the counter with her hand on a half-gallon vodka bottle. Hello, Joe Bill. And as I walk to the counter to get in line, she slides down the counter and waves me forward. I'm like, well, that's a little strange, but okay. So I go and put my beer up on the counter with my left hand, because I think by that time I'd already come off the horse and had the problem with my right wrist. Thus the need for more beer. And so I put my beer on the counter, and before the woman could ring me up or I could say anything, this scraggly woman leans over to me and gets in my face and goes, "Do you own your own home?" I just kind of like stood back and blinked a little bit. Next thing you know, she's back in my face going, "Do you own your own home?" And I'm like, "No, I rent." And that didn't seem to really make sense to her. She sat there and pondered that for a minute, and she goes, "Don't you own your own home?" And I just kind of was like, "No." And the woman at the counter was trying really hard not to laugh, and Larry by this time was conspicuously absent. And so this kind of goes back and forth a little bit. The woman says, "You sure you don't own your own home?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure." And she looks at me, and she looks at me again. She goes, "You ain't got no pajamas." And I'm like, "No, I'm not wearing pajamas." And she's like, "Don't you own your own home?" And I'm like, "No." Still this is going on. And then she looks down at my feet, and she looks back up, and she goes, "You ain't got no slippers. Where's your slippers?" So I was like, "No, I'm wearing boots. I don't have my slippers on me." And she's like, "Don't you own your own home?" And I'm like, "No, sorry, I rent." And then finally, she ponders that for a little bit longer. And then she decides to give it one more try to see if she gets a different answer. She gets back in my face. "Do you own your own home?" I'm like, "No." She goes, "Well, where you sleep at?" Me being me, I hooked my thumb over at Larry. I said, "I sleep with him. He's got a Yorkie." And that, my friends, is the story of when Larry took me to breakfast. Also known as, "Do you own your own home?"